Welcome, everyone, to this very special installment in our series, The Outlook for Brazilian Democracy. Today, it is my immense honor to welcome Ministro Luís Roberto Barroso, a Brazilian Supreme Court Justice and President of Brazil's Superior Electoral Court, and a key figure in the fight for election integrity and against disinformation. Thank you, Minister, for taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you also to our truly stellar panel of UChicago faculty, Brodwyn, Fischer, Tom Ginsburg, and Stokes, who I'll introduce a bit later. And thanks to the Chicago Center for Democracy for co-sponsoring this event. A quick note on logistics. After Minister Barroso's remarks, we'll hear from our three panelists and then give Minister Barroso a chance to respond. Now, turning to our guest, I could not possibly summarize Minister Barroso's work and accomplishments, even if I had an hour, but I would like to take a minute or two to give you a sense of the man and the context he's operating in. Minister Barroso graduated in law from Universidade do Estado do Rio de Janeiro, UERJ. He holds a master's degree in law from Yale, and he earned his PhD from UERJ, where he's now a tenured professor of constitutional law. He served as state attorney of Rio de Janeiro from 1985 to 2013, and was nominated to the Supreme Federal Court by President Dilma Rousseff in 2013. He served as president of the Superior Electoral Court as well since 2020. Justice Barroso has authored many books and articles, including Technological Revolution, Democratic Recession and Climate Change, The Limits of Law in a Changing World, How to Save the Amazon, Why a Living Forest is worth more than a cut down one. And just a few weeks ago, Hate, Lies, and Democracy, an article that earned Barroso some typically crude personal insults from Brazil's president, Jair Bolsonaro, by calling out, quote, the rise of true digital militias, verbal terrorists who disseminate hate, lies, conspiracy theories, and attacks on people and on democracy. This is just the latest installment. Over the past year, Minister Barroso's efforts to fight disinformation and defend democratic institutions have led Bolsonaro to publicly personally attack him on countless occasions, calling him, quote, the one who wants a dirty, undemocratic election, quote, not to mention idiot, imbecile, and son of a bitch. The peak of Bolsonaro's petulant rage came during his attempt last year to preemptively cast doubt on the integrity of Brazil's electronic voting system. Down in the polls because of COVID and economic woes, Bolsonaro made a series of wild, unfounded allegations of voter fraud and election stealing, suggesting that he would not accept the results in 2022 if he lost. Sound familiar? The difference is that Brazil's electronic voting machines are a worldwide gold standard for security and transparency. So Bolsonaro pushed for a return to paper ballots, eventually as a constitutional amendment in Congress. As head of the Electoral Court, Mr. Barroso publicly defended the e-voting system and patiently explained why paper ballots would make the election less, not more secure. Support for the amendment, never strong, withered, and Bolsonaro seized. On the day of the vote, Bolsonaro scheduled a military parade in Brasilia. As a handful of outdated tanks rolled by Congress, the amendment was voted down. Barroso became a public enemy in the Bolsoverse, with the president calling him names amid false insinuations of wrongdoing. And that was just August. There were still many more episodes to come, including Bolsonaro's wildly anti-constitutional speeches in September, 7, I think, ongoing Supreme Court cases involving the president, and probably some more things happening right now on Twitter and Facebook if you look. But you get the idea. Minister Barroso's responses have always been devastatingly civil. This obsession with me, he said after one fusillade, is neither justified nor reciprocated. In his subtle but fierce Twitter feed, his books, thoughts, and songs of the week say all that needs saying, such as The Dictatorship Laid Bare by Elio Gaspari, or The Relic by Essa de Queiroz, or Fixation by Kid Abelio. He modestly points out that even the victory over paper ballots was a kind of a loss, since it distracted from more important questions, including political violence against women. Still, he's right when he says, quote, if I'm causing this much discomfort, I must be doing my job. Yet Minister Barroso is not only a public figure, he's a thinker, a profound theorist of democracy and its challenges. He describes the political reality of many countries today as mentirocracia, or lieocracy, which he defines as, quote, the diffusion of untruth and false narratives as a method of governance. Disinformation becomes instrumentalized by organized groups who deliberately target institutions. The result is not only political, but moral crises in which, quote, lies and falsehoods become part of everyday life as though they were natural. How then can we have fair elections in a time of fake news? Please join me in welcoming Minister Luís Roberto Barroso.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I thank Ben Lessing for this extremely kind and vivid introduction, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I would like to thank the invitation, and also say it's a elevated honor to be here with Professor Tom Ginsburg, who is a leading scholar in comparative constitutional law. Everyone reads him. And I also would like to greet Professor Brodwyn Fischer from the History Department and Susan Stokes from the Chicago Center on Democracy. I have divided this presentation in three parts, Ben. First one, I gave the title Democracy, Populism, and Fair Elections. Part two is the ascent of social media, disinformation, and content regulation. And the third part, the fight against fake news in Brazil. I have the superstition of dividing my presentations and my articles in three parts, and I won't have the time to explain why. So I go to part one, democracy, populism, and fair election, starting with a short conceptual set of comments. Democratic constitutionalism is the ideology that prevailed in the 20th century over the alternative competitive projects, which were communism, fascism, Nazism, military regimes, and religious fundamentalisms. Democratic constitutionalism is an institutional arrangement comprised of two major ideas that merged at the end of the 20th century: constitutionalism and democracy. Constitutionalism is the heir to the liberal revolutions and basically expresses the idea of limited power, rule of law, and respect for fundamental rights. Democracy, in turn, means popular sovereignty, free elections, and majority rule. In most countries, democracy was only consolidated when the 20th century was already advanced, because you can only call a democracy regime where there is universal suffrage and the abolishing the restrictions to the right to vote, restrictions that were related to wealth, education, race, and gender, only ended when the 20th century was already advanced. So constitutional democracy means this regime of popular sovereignty, free elections, and respect for fundamental rights. Most democracies in the world, as Professor Tom Ginsburg has extensively shown, include either a Supreme Court or a constitutional court in their institutional arrangement. And the role of these courts, constitutional courts or Supreme Court, is to arbitrate the tensions that often arise between democracy and constitutionalism, between popular sovereignty and constitutional values. And it's up to the court to protect fundamental rights and to protect the rules of the democratic game against any attempts by the majority to abuse power. And recent experiences have shown that when these courts fail in that job, democracy collapses or suffer major erosion. So I said that democracy was the winning ideology of the 20th century. As we all know, something seems to have gone wrong in many parts of the world lately, in a scenario that has been characterized by different authors as democratic recession, democratic retrogression, abusive constitutionalism, competitive authoritarianism, illiberal democracy, autocratic legalism, among other derogatory terms. And these expressions have been used to identify the experiences that have taken place in different parts of the world, in different countries, namely some of them, Hungary, Poland, Russia, Turkey, Georgia, Ukraine, Venezuela, Nicaragua, El Salvador, among others, and even consolidated democracies like the ones in the US and the UK have lived moments of turmoil and disbelief in institutions. It's a good question to ask, what's going on? What's happening in the world that led to these problems I'm trying to describe here? In my view, there are three different phenomena underway in these parts of the world, which are populism, extremism, and authoritarianism. These concepts, they're different and they are independent, but when simultaneously manifested, which has often been the case, they pose a serious threat to democracy. I, of course, won't describe each one of them. We wouldn't have time, but making a long story short and combining some of the characteristics of each of these dysfunctions, it's possible to establish that authoritarian extremist populism, one, they makes an artificial division of society between the pure people on one hand and the corrupt elites on the other hand. It also has an anti-pluralist position, considering the populists themselves as the only legitimate representatives of the people, and consequently they treat the opposition as if they were enemies of the nation. And in the cases of the far-right populism, which has taken over in many parts of the world, they often have racist, misogynistic, homophobic, and xenophobic positions. Extremist and authoritarian populism in these different countries, it uses similar strategies when populism seeks to establish itself. And these strategies, these common strategies are, first, direct communication with their supporters, more recently using social media. Secondly, they bypass or by co-option of intermediary institutions like the legislature, the press, and civil society bodies. And thirdly, attacks on Supreme Courts, constitutional courts, and electoral authorities where they exist. They usually attempt to capture them and occupy these courts with submissive judges. This is the scenario we are all living in. And the reason I opened this specific chapter, Ben, in the beginning of my presentation, trying to discuss democracy, democratic recession, and populism, it's because one of the main tools these movements, these historical processes have deployed have been disinformation campaigns, hate speech, slander, lies, and conspiracy theories. And while I don't particularly like the name, these behaviors are often referred under the label of fake news, which is the subject of our conversation. And one of the worst consequences of the use of fake news is that they undermine free and fair elections, because fake news contribute to, one, deceive voters in the first place. first place. Fake news violate fundamental rights, and fake news compromise free speech, tainting the public debate. So I like to say that contemporary democracies are made of votes, fundamental rights, and public debate. Fake news, as I just said, compromise these three basic elements of democracy, and that's the reason why we need to fight them. Now I move on to the second part of my presentation, the essence of social media, disinformation, and content regulation. I start by a quick mention to the digital revolution, to the technological revolution we are all living under. The digital revolution, which started, I should say, in the final decades of the 20th century, and is characterized, the digital revolution, by the massification of personal computers, smartphones, and most notably, the internet, connecting billions of people throughout the world. And the digital revolution has completely changed the way we live, how we do research, how we buy books, how we book a hotel, how we listen to music. I got an email from Spotify a couple of weeks ago saying the music, the songs that you like are the following. Say, okay, thank you. So this is a whole new world we are living with a totally new vocabulary, with words that identify applications that we didn't know until yesterday, and without which we could no longer live. I would just mention a few of them: Google, Amazon, WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Waze, Spotify, Dropbox, iTunes, Netflix, and for those who are single, there's also Tinder. So these are all words and utilities that didn't exist a few years ago. Ben mentioned I was an LLM at Yale back in the late 80s. You wouldn't imagine how difficult it was to make applications. You had to go to the post office and send a letter asking for the application forms. And it would take like 2 or 3 weeks. You would get the forms, and then you would fill out the forms and send them back. It was like could take you a whole year. Just recently, one of my clerks went to do an LLM abroad, and in a couple of weeks, everything was solved. So it's a totally new world we are living. Say the brave new world of information technology, biotechnology, nanotechnology, 3D printing, quantum computing, autonomous cars, and the Internet of Things. Algorithm has become the most important concept of our time. These changes, many of them for good, of course, they bring several risks that I will mention very quickly, because there's one specific risk we want to deal with here. But some of these risks of the digital revolution involve the risks of a world that could come to be dominated by artificial intelligence, a phenomenon identified as singularity. There's the risks of genetic engineering, with consequent fears of eugenics and the temptation to create more intelligent, more good-looking, and stronger human beings, and thus increasing inequality in the world. There's the risk to privacy that we are all dealing with the use of DNA, facial recognition, and with all the information that the technological platforms gather on all of us from our navigating in the internet. And one risk that is particularly important for our subject here, which is the use of the internet to practice crimes and other important improper behaviors. The digital revolution brings us to this matter I want to discuss a little bit further here, which is the social media. The internet, it has revolutionized the world of interpersonal and social communication, expanding exponentially the access to information and knowledge, and in addition, created a public sphere where anyone can express their ideas, opinions, and disseminate news. Before the internet, the spread of news and opinions relied to a great extension on the professional press. And it was up to the professional press to gather facts, spread news, and filter opinions by the criteria of journalism ethics. Thus, there was a minimum editorial control over the quality and veracity of what was published. The internet, with the emergence of websites, personal blogs, and above all, social media, enabled the wide circulation of ideas, opinions, and information with no filter. The negative consequence has been that it has allowed for the spread of ignorance, lies, and the practice of crimes of different nature. It's very important to highlight here the weight of social media in contemporary societies and in contemporary politics. Social media is one of the most striking consequences of the digital revolution. So pay attention to these numbers. I call your attention to these numbers. Facebook has nearly 3 billion accounts. YouTube has over 2 billion users, and WhatsApp has equally over 2 billion active users. In Brazil, according to a survey conducted by the Senate, 79% of the population has as its main source of information WhatsApp. Television comes second with 50%, followed closely by YouTube, 49%, Facebook, 44%, news sites, 38%. And only 8% of the population has printed newspapers as their source of information. I think only dinosaurs like myself still read papers, actual papers. No wonder they are experiencing a crisis on their business model. And one interesting observation I want to make here is at the beginning, there was a belief that the internet should be a space free from regulation, of any kind of regulation, economic, commercial, and protecting free speech was the, I would say, basic concern. And the words you would hear at the time was that it should be free, open, and unregulated. And of course, this perception has changed. And I would like to talk a couple of minutes about that, about how this perception has changed. And nowadays, it has become sort of a consensus that the internet needs some kind of regulation, and with approaches in different areas, including, and I'll mention three, economic, comprising, we need antitrust regulation, we need to protect copyright, we need to protect consumers, and we need to have fair taxation. So, of course, we need some sort of economic regulation of the internet and of social media. In the second place, privacy needs to be protected, and there's been legislation in different parts of the world to protect users' data to be utilized by technological platforms without the consent. And thirdly, and this is what really interests us here, we need some sort of content control and establishing platform liability rules. And we need here to be very careful to balance important and opposing demands, which are the preservation of freedom of speech on one hand, and repression of illegal conduct in social media on the other hand. I must say that everything that I think and discuss and everything that I'm going to say here involving regulation of social media, and then I'll tell a bit what we've done here, we always keep in mind the importance of free speech for democracy. What's interesting, though, is that the same values that justify the protection of free speech in certain cases justify the regulation of social media to protect freedom of speech. The regulation of social media, which has become unavoidable, I think, should seek to curb three types of improper behaviors, I would say. First one, inauthentic behavior. Second, illicit content. And third, disinformation. When I say inauthentic behaviors, it's a behavior that involves the use of automated systems to forge engagement or to drown out third-party speech. We're talking about robots, fake profiles or accounts, and trolls that are people hired to disseminate fake news. Second thing that needs to be faced by social media regulation is the illegal content. Things like terrorism, child abuse, incitement to crime and violence, attacks on democracy. And in the third place, regulation needs to face disinformation, which consists in the deliberate creation or dissemination of false news, of fake news, generally with the purpose of obtaining personal gain, political, economic, personal, causing harm to people and to the institutions. So the whole world right now is discussing the best model to regulate social media, mixing legislation, self-regulation, and regulated self-regulation. And there is a certain consensus about people that want to strike a proper balance between free speech and facing disinformation, that the moderation of content should follow some criteria. I will synthesize them in three topics: transparency, so that people know clearly the terms of use of the platform, and also information about political advertising on their networks. Second, so first one, transparency. Criteria to moderate content, transparency. Due process, so removal decisions and other decisions must be reasoned, albeit objectively, and the user must be notified, and they should have some sort of opportunity to appeal the decision. And in the third place, they should follow a criterion of fairness. People should not be banned from any platform for the wrong reasons. So it's not acceptable discrimination based on unacceptable factors like gender, sex orientation, or even political preferences, I should add. So this is the end of the second part of my talk, and I'll start the third part. But in the first part, I tried to outline an idea of democracy, what democratic recession has been in the past couple of decades in the world, and how authoritarian extremist populism has utilized the social media to circulate, to propagate conspiracy theories, lies, anti-scientific behaviors, and other harmful actions. In the second part of my presentation, I try to highlight the essence of social media as a major consequence of the digital revolution, how the social media have become in many parts of the world, if not all over the world, the main source of information for many people, how social media, for such reason, needs to be regulated to a certain extent on the economic level to protect privacy and to fight improper behaviors. I tried briefly to describe which were these improper behaviors, inauthentic behavior, which is using robots and fake profiles to create the impression that everyone is talking about those fake news that they are disseminating. Secondly, to fight illegal content, the practice of crimes online. And thirdly, how to deal with disinformation. So I think we'll need moderation of content and to strike a balance between freedom of expression and fighting these improper behaviors and disinformation. We need the platforms to act with transparency, with respecting a minimum due process, and acting fairness to avoid any sort of discrimination. That's a brief synthesis of what I said so far. And I come to this third and last part, which is Brazil's Superior Electoral Court, the fight against fake news and the attacks by the president. I'll make here, Ben, a very brief conceptual note. Elections in Brazil are organized and supervised by an electoral justice, which is a branch of the judiciary. It is part of the federal judiciary, but it's present in all states. So the electoral justice plays a very important role in preserving democracy in Brazil. Its top body is the Superior Electoral Court, which has 7 judges. 3 of them, including the president, which right now is myself, 3 of them are members of the Supreme Court. 2 other ones are members of the High Court, which is the highest court for federal legislation. And the 2 last spots are occupied by jurists selected by the Supreme Court in a list with 3 names, and then the president picks 1. So this is how the electoral system in Brazil functions. I know there's an American audience to this talk. I know things are different in the US, but here in Brazil, we have a national body that watches over the elections, and we have subdivisions in every state taking care of the elections. Now, I'll briefly describe what's happened here in the past 2 elections to help people assess what has been the impact of social media and of fake news in the political process. In the 2018 elections that was won by the current presidents, those elections represented a major change in the Brazilian electoral patterns. In Brazil, as some of you know, candidates have access to television and radio, free access to television and radio for a certain period by criteria of allocation of time that is prescribed in a statute. And the amount of time in this allocation of time is in a direct relation to the size of the political party in Congress. So traditionally in Brazil, the time a candidate, a presidential candidate, was assigned for television time was decisive for the election. And it was a very important factor in the alliances that were established for the electoral dispute. However, in 2018, the candidate assigned for the longest time on radio and television finished fourth in the dispute. This candidate, following the usual pattern, struck alliances with many other parties other than his, so that he could get more time on television. And he had almost half of the television time. And all the other candidates had the other half. And that was deemed to be decisive. And he placed fourth in the elections. And on the other hand, the winning candidate that had no relevant television time was the beneficiary of a great strategy of using social media and messaging apps. Such strategy included bulking messages at voters, along with spreading negative news about other candidates. I think I should say all candidates were spreading bad news, I would say, or bad comments about the other candidates, but no one did it in such a professional way as was done by the winning candidate. And the truth is that the electoral justice, the legislation, the case law, the administrative rules that govern the elections, no one was really prepared for this new reality, despite the fact that one could see it was coming from what happened in the Brexit voting and in the American elections. Interestingly, in the 2018 election, one of the targets of the disinformation campaigns was the electoral process itself, with groundless accusations of fraud and about the reliability of the electronic voting ballot boxes that we use in Brazil. I'll talk about that in a minute. So in the 2020 elections, having learned the lessons, I was vice president in the 2018 elections, and I was the president in the 2020 elections. Having learned the lesson with experience from 2018, the Superior Electoral Court coordinated a warfare operation for protection of the electoral system against fake news. It was a very peculiar election in 2020. First, we had to convince voters to go to the voting stations in the middle of a pandemic. That was the first thing. Second, we had to prepare a major health and sanitary plan and distribute protective equipment all over the country. And we were fortunately very successful. We got 113 million people to go to the voting stations in the middle of a pandemic, which we consider an achievement. But above all, we prepared a very comprehensive plan to combat disinformation, especially when aimed at the credibility of the electoral process. And this program had three main axes. First, fighting disinformation with accurate information and immediate responses. Second axis was priority focus on the control by the networks of behaviors, not content of the messages. And third, media education of society. And I'll mention very briefly what we did under each of these axes when dealing with fake news, the three strategies we adopted were: one, we entered partnerships with all major technological platform and messaging services, customized partnerships with special measures that they would take. And here I should say that from 2018 to 2020, there was a change of heart in those platforms, and they were much more helpful in 2020 than they were in 2018. And I still think they should be more helpful, but they have changed their behavior. And so that was the first thing we did. We spoke with all platforms that were relevant in Brazil, and we entered a partnership, and they were partners in fighting fake news. We also entered an agreement with all major fact-checking agencies to verify information and debunk fake news. And we created a page at the Electoral Justice site called Fact or Rumor, with true information confirmed by the fact-checking agencies. And we also entered an agreement with all telecom companies so that people could access that page in a zero rating fashion without having their internet access package affected by those accesses. And indeed, we had million accesses to that page. And in the partnership with the platforms, whenever we had to deny fake news, they would have a link sending the user to this page, as I said, that had millions of accesses. As for control of inauthentic behavior, which is much better than fighting content, it's monitoring the artificial groups, the fake profiles, the fake accounts, the user robots to amplify fake news. WhatsApp itself banned more than 360,000 accounts during the elections in Brazil. And we had a coordination unit to combat disinformation. We would monitor the normal media, the traditional media, and all the social media every minute, every day. And we would debunk any fake news immediately using all the means that we had. And finally, we had this media education campaign with a major YouTuber, was a biologist and YouTuber, very famous. And he was on television explaining what was fake news and how to avoid spreading it. And I myself, I should say, also made several videos. I even started accounts in WhatsApp and Instagram so that I could help fighting fake news. And let me tell you, it's like diving into a swamp. But there I was trying to bring awareness of this problem. And to be true, we think we were very successful in the 2020 elections in fighting fake news relating to the electoral process. Finally, then, it was only after the elections that the president started to attack the electoral court and to raise suspicions about the system. And it was a very bizarre phenomenon because the president had been elected by a large margin in the second round. But still, he said that there was fraud because he should have won in the first round. And he raised suspicions about previous elections when even the candidates that were defeated accepted the defeat. As some of you might know, Brazil adopts since 1996 a system of electronic voting machines, we call electronic ballot boxes, that have eliminated fraud, that have always tarnished, I would say, Brazilian democracy at the time when the vote was on paper ballots. So at that time, paper ballots would, disappear or appear with more votes than voters. Votes disappeared or multiplied. And when the transcription of the votes to the maps, they were all frauded. We ended this problem when we adopted the electronic ballot boxes as of 1996. No case of fraud has ever been proven or seriously alleged, but still the electronic ballot boxes were the target of a major campaign by the president, and his supporters, as Ben mentioned earlier, presented a constitutional amendment before Congress to return to the paper vote, and he wanted public manual counting of the votes, which has always been the path to fraud in the Brazilian history. So myself and many others put a lot of energy to fight this, and I was invited to Congress, presented the reasons why we were against it. Congress eventually rejected the proposal. The president got very upset and insulted all those that didn't support his ideas. I took the position of just ignoring what was personal and being very strong and powerful about defending the system. But as for personal attacks, I made the option of not fighting in the mud, I would say, and just ignoring. Some people ask me if I don't think there should be a punishment. Maybe. But for some people, the worst punishment is being who they are. Finally, we are dealing with this Telegram problem. They don't have headquarters in Brazil. They don't have a legal representative in Brazil. This is going to be an issue as of February, what to do, and if we should allow a platform that you cannot abide by Brazilian laws and be subject to Brazilian courts. So let's see. Ideally, Congress should deal with this. If Congress doesn't, probably the electoral justice will have to take care of it. So my conclusions, I think we have won, even if only temporarily, the battle against disinformation that intended to attack the credibility of the electoral system and the return to the previous model in which the risk of fraud is much greater. I think, fortunately, we were successful on this. Fake news, like crime in general, cannot be eliminated, but only fought more efficiently. And to this end, it is essential to have an active collaboration of the technological platforms and messaging services. This will require some degree of state regulation and some degree of self-regulation. And finally, the participation of society itself is also essential. People need to understand the mechanisms of propagation of fake news and learn not to pass on information whose authenticity they are not sure. Therefore, it is necessary to raise the awareness of the population through constant media education. And finally, Ben, I think these have been pretty tough times in Brazil, but I'm happy to say that so far, I think that the institutions were capable of resisting and preserving the democratic system. It's been a complicated time in Brazil, but we have elections this year, and I'm pretty sure that on January 1st, we'll have a new president or a re-elected president elected in a free, clean, and democratic election. So I hope, and I'm doing my best to assure that. And I'll be happy to talk to our guests. And thank you very much for the invitation once again, Ben.
Thank you, Minister Barroso, for your an incredible present for 3 presentations, really, that brought together, I think, both, a profound lesson in the history of democracy as a system of government, a very intriguing exploration of the times we live in and the sort of digital revolution, and really the political implications of that and how that breaks down at the ground level, really institutions being pushed to the limit, trying to protect democracy as the situation on the ground, as the media landscape, as really the social landscape itself changes in profound ways. So I just want to thank you again for taking the time to share your thoughts with us. I also share your hope that whatever happens in the fall of 2022, that we have a new president of Brazil who was duly elected through a democratic process and not through some sort of alternative process. Let's just leave it at that. Let me now turn to our panel. I'm going to introduce our 3 panelists today, and then they'll each take a chance, have a chance to respond to Mr. Barroso's comments and put forth any questions or ideas that they'd like him to comment on. So our first panelist is Brodwyn Fischer, professor of history at University of Chicago. She was also my predecessor as a director for Center for Latin American Studies for a long stretch and really made class what it is today. It's a pleasure to have you here, Brody. Brodwyn Fischer is a historian of inequality and its persistence. She specializes in the study of Brazil and Latin America with a focus particularly on informality, cities, citizenship, law, migration, race, slavery, and its afterlives. Her first book, The Poverty of Rights, from 2008, received awards from the Social Science History Association, the Urban History Association, the Conference on Latin American History, and the Brazilian Studies Association. Her co-edited volume, Cities from Scratch, explores the many ways in which poverty and informality have shaped the Latin American urban experience. And her current book, Intimate Inequalities, Urbanism, Slavery, and Bounded Freedom in a Brazilian City, explores the historical coevolution of urbanism and informality in Recife. She serves on the editorial boards of Past and Present and the Journal of Latin American Studies, as well as the International Advisory Committee for the Centro de Estudos da Metrópole in São Paulo and the board of the Urban History Association. Second panelist, Tom Ginsburg, is the Leo Spitz Professor of International Law and the Ludwig and Hilda Wolf Research Scholar, as well as a Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Ginsburg focuses on comparative and international law from an interdisciplinary perspective. He holds a BA, JD, and PhD degrees from the University of California at Berkeley. His latest book, How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, was written together with Aziz Houk, who was our panelist on the first event of this cycle, The Outlook for Brazilian Democracy. Ginsburg's early books include Judicial Review in New Democracies, which won the C. Herman Pritchett Award from the American Political Science Association, The Endurance of National Constitutions, which also won a Best Book Prize from APSA, and Judicial Reputation. He currently co-directs the Comparative Constitutions Project, an effort funded by the National Science Foundation to gather and analyze the constitutions of all independent nation states since 1789. Before entering law teaching, he served as legal advisor at the Iran-US Claims Tribunal in The Hague, and he continues to work with numerous international development agencies and foreign governments on legal and constitutional reform. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And finally with us is my colleague in political science, Sue Stokes, who's the Tiffany and Margaret Blake Distinguished Service Professor and Director of the Chicago Center on Democracy at the University of Chicago, also a co-sponsor of this event. Stokes' research interests include democratic theory and how democracy functions in developing societies, distributive politics, and comparative political behavior. Her research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, Fulbright, the American Philosophical Society, and the Russell Sage Foundation. Her co-authored book, Brokers, Voters, and Clientelism, won Best Book Prizes from the Comparative Politics and Comparative Democratization sections of the American Political Science Association. Among her earlier books, Mandates and Democracy, Neoliberalism by Surprise in Latin America, received prizes from APSA, Comparative Democratization section, and from the Society for Comparative Research. Her articles have appeared in journals, including the American Science Review, World Politics, and the Latin American Research. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And I also must say, which I only learned recently, And somewhat to the shame of our political science department, Sue Stokes was the first woman to be tenured in our department at University of Chicago. So an honor, and at the same time, something to think about. We're going to go in alphabetical order. So Brody, maybe you could begin.
Right. Thank you, Ben. And thank you so much, Minister Barroso, for a really clear and enlightening presentation. We are short on time, and there are also some wonderful questions in the chat. So I'm going to try to be fairly brief in my comments and questions. I lack Minister Barroso's elegance, and so I'm going to divide my comments into 2 parts instead of 3, not quite such a pretty number, but I hope it will give us all some things to think about. The first thing that I wanted to say is that the clarity of the presentation today is really indicative of the tenor of Minister Barroso's academic writings. And for those of you that haven't had the pleasure of reading his writing, mainly in Portuguese, but some in English, about the concept of constitutional democracy, the role of Brazil's constitution in transnational constitutional history, and especially his considerations of the changing role of the judiciary in the political arena. Some of the most subtle and interesting reflections on how it is that in the 20th century, and especially after World War II, you see this transformation, especially in civil law systems, of the role of the Constitution and constitutional courts in democratic regimes, and how that has forced the judiciary out of its traditional technical role as an interpreter of laws, a kind of almost machine that interprets the letter of the law and applies it as it was meant to be written in a kind of transparent and automatic way. The way in which the demands of modern democracy have forced the judicial authorities into new kinds of roles. And those roles have to do with interpreting the principles of constitutional law, but also sometimes with other factors that Minister Barroso has in very interesting ways highlighted. And among those are the role of the judiciary sometimes in exercising a kind of representative role that otherwise we might give to the legislature or we might give to the executive, sometimes representing currents and needs, both moral needs and conscious needs of people who live within a given society in a way that the legislature and the executive cannot always do. And so how all of this leads to a question is that the latest piece that I read in depth about these issues that Minister Barroso wrote was actually from right before the election of Jair Bolsonaro, which I think that most of you who read Portuguese can find easily online. But I'm curious, after 2018, there are at least 2 ways in which this relationship between the judiciary and the political realm seem to have changed really dramatically. The first is that there has been a fairly widespread critique of the role of judges as political figures, as celebrities. And of course, Sergio Moro would be the most representative figure in that arena. But there's also reasoned, not fake news, not attacks, but reasoned critiques from many dimensions of society on the ways in which many judges, and Minister Barroso yourself sometimes included, have become public figures. That, you noted at the beginning of this that often when you speak, media are present. You've certainly been the victim of a lot of attacks and defamations on social media and elsewhere. And there's a lot of worry, I think, from people who think about constitutional law that somehow in this situation of emergency that we all find ourselves in, that there's something dangerous about the emerging role of judges and other kinds of judicial figures in the political arena in ways that go beyond what you wrote about with such constraint before the end of the 2010s. So I wanted to ask about that and what your reflections are on those issues now. And a second shorter question that has to do with similar issues, and this is all still kind of in this first section, has to do with, in the particular arena of fake news, I'm so interested to hear the menu of activities that I think very laudably and very admirably the High Electoral Court has been undertaking to prevent the corruption of elections. But it's very striking how few of those fall within the traditional realm of what the judiciary does. And so sort of thinking about what is this problem of fake news forcing members of the judiciary to do in terms of actions in society that is very different than what judicial figures have done in the past. So hopefully those are things to think about. I don't know if we'll have time to answer them. The last thing that I wanted to touch on, the second general area that I wanted to touch on, and I'll be very brief, and that is that I think that all of us in virtually every country that I'm familiar with are sharing the problem of polarization, of populism, of the role of fake news and the role of social media in all of that. But it strikes me that there are many dimensions of this problem that go so much beyond what the law can control. That is that fake news is much more of a problem in societies where the faith that people have in institutions is very low, where levels of trust among citizens are very low, where people don't feel like they have representation in a democratic setting. And also in settings where fake news goes along with this threat of violence. And of course, I very much include my own society in that. In the United States, it's very clear that there's a connection there. But in Brazil as well, there is such a widespread recourse to violence outside of the judicial system, many times outside of the realm where the judiciary is able to sanction violence. And it strikes me that the coming together of those factors is what makes fake news so dangerous. And so no matter what is done at the level of a high electoral court in order to counter the spread of fake news on social media, you still have this kind of tinderbox that comes with the lack of faith in institutions, the widespread accessibility of arms and the low bar to justifiable violence in the eyes of many people, and that those things come together to really create a situation that goes so much beyond what the judiciary can control. And so I'm curious what you think of that, if that seems like an analysis that is useful or interesting, and how you think Brazil in particular might meet those challenges. Thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. We're going to go through all the panelists and then give Minister Barroso a chance to respond. So Tom, would you like to make some comments?
Great. Time is short, so I'll be trying to be very quick. I really just wanted to start with an observation, which is, that this issue that the minister is raising and the solution is something we Americans can learn a lot from. This issue of basically having a national level authority to run elections is exactly what's on the table right now with the voting rights bills, about which we may or may not end the filibuster. I think that it's a two-edged sword, but this example shows just how helpful it could be. So we have something to learn. My question, to the extent it's a question or observation, is there's a whole dimension of democracy which we haven't really talked about, which is political parties. And, Brazil has, for those who don't know, an extremely fragmented political party system. I think Bolsonaro's party got, 800,000 votes in a country of 200 million people before he came along. And so it's very personality driven. And personalities, of course, love the fake news. They love the social media because they can communicate directly. As you said, populist leaders can communicate directly with the public without intermediating institutions, one of which is parties. So I guess the question, and it may be not so much a question for you, but for all of us, is can we think of cases where parties, would be incentivized to actually go along with this regulation as a way of strengthening them, because it strengthens them as filters of information and policy preferences. I know in some cases we have examples of what Brodwyn was talking about, where parties actually kind of get into the ecology. I'm thinking of India primarily, where you have party-sponsored internet mobs that actually will spill over into real violence in some cases. And that's part of the governing coalition strategy. But is there a way to think about how to get parties in more I don't know, in societies like the United States to get on board with the idea that they have something to gain from regulating fake news? Because right now I think they're both, in the United States at least, thinking that this could work to their advantage if they could just tell the right lies. So it's mostly a comment and not a crisp question, but I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Tom, and particular thanks for the brevity. Sue?
Yeah, just super briefly, because I know there's some Q&A questions as well. Thank you so much for that fascinating presentation, Minister Barroso. I also, like Tom, just want to make a very brief observation. I remember when the last time that I think Ben and Brody and I were on a panel together was just before the Bolsonaro election in 2018, and they made very incisive and frightening statements. And I think a lot of us there sort of felt like taking a big old megaphone and saying, hey, Brazil, don't do what we've done. We're in big trouble here. It's interesting to reflect now in retrospect. If you had asked any political scientist who knew anything about democratic instability then, which of the two countries was going to be more prone to destabilized democracy, we all would have said Brazil, because we all know that richer countries have lots of advantages in holding on to democratic institutions, and that a history independent of that, of levels of income, a history of democratic interruptions, especially coups, continues to be very devastating to democracy going forward. It's sort of like you have cancer, you go into remission, but you've got to be a certain number of years out before your probability of getting a relapse are the same as somebody who's never had cancer. Same thing with coups, and of course there have been many in Brazilian history, and we've never really had a real live one in the United States. Well, here we are in 2022, and we are in the middle of a slow motion self-coup, or autogolpe or palace coup in the United States. Why are we in the middle of it? Well, we had a sitting president who lost a fair election and who has spread the belief among his followers. Now somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of Republican voters believe that the election was stolen. And that same former president is poised to run for election again in 2024. And who knows what's going to happen. So it looks like, as of now, it looks like we're out of the woods a bit, but I think 50 years from now, who knows what the story is going to be. So, I think that in a number of ways we've fared, who knows what's going to happen in Brazil, but fingers crossed, but we've fared very, very badly in the United States. And it's surprising that that's true. And I think one of the kind of contrasts between the two countries that's relevant to this comparison is exactly what Tom mentioned. And that is that there is a relatively, depoliticized, centralized, and judicialized, as Brody pointed out, election administration system. And we don't have that in the United States. So the age of our democracy becomes a disadvantage because we labor under terrible historical legacies that come from our racial politics and from our decentralization. Would that we could have a tabula rasa and start over again with a new constitution, right, Tom? That didn't have that had direct elections for the president of the United States. I think Brazil, reinstituted direct elections in 1989. We don't have direct elections for the president. We don't have a centralized electoral authority administration, and we're not going to get it right now. So I guess it's not a question, it's an observation. It's a somewhat frustrated and sad observation, but again, many thanks for the really fascinating comments.
I'm going to just take the step of asking one of the questions from the Q&A right now and adding it to the queue. I think the other two questions were to a certain extent addressed by Minister Barroso's comments, but we can circle back to them if there's still time at the end. So I'm going to read that question. I look forward to Mr. Barroso's answers, but I want to just say that the issue about armed threats that came up in both Tom and Brody's comments will be the topic of our next event in the series, The Outlook for Brazilian democracy when we speak with 4 experts on militias, armed groups, armed citizenry, the role of the armed forces, and the role of the Polícia Militar in precisely these kind of potential incidents of violence and how they might interact in a possibly negative way. So, and the question comes from Arthur Schott Lopez, a PhD student here at University of Chicago. Ministro, many commentators saw the appointment of General Fernando Azevedo e Silva to the DG of the TSE, I'm going to say Diretoria Geral of the Tribunal Superior Eleitoral, as a strategically smart move ahead of the October election, but also one that suggests that the military continues to hold the country hostage. Will Brazilian political actors be able to send the military back to the barracks once the Bolsonaro presidency is over, or are we fated to be under military tutelage for an unspecified amount of time? How can Brazilian politicians rein in the military and the military police in the states and right the wrongs of the 1980s democratic transition? Okay, there it is, Minister Barroso.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to all the participants. I really appreciate your comments and questions. We're always learning. I will start addressing Brodwyn comments, which were the toughest ones to address. I'd say I organized them broadly in 3 basic categories. The first one is the change in the role of the courts, and that's quite true. After World War II, there was what I have called in articles the Americanization of constitutional law. So the model of supremacy of the parliament, which was the prevailing model in Europe until the Second World War, starts to change after the Second World War with Germany, and they create their constitutional court, and then Italy, and then all the countries in the world, with very few exceptions. Tom, in one of his articles, has the statistics like 80-something% of the countries have constitutional courts or Supreme Courts. This, of course, has changed partially the role of the judiciary and constitutional courts. And you have courts that have been very important in political matters over time. In America, from 1954 to, I would say, the early 70s, Warren died in 69, I think, but you had a Supreme Court in the United States that was very active in many areas, including protection of fundamental rights and rights of people accused in criminal lawsuits. The role that a Supreme Court plays in the institutional arrangement of a country is not static, it's dynamic, and it differs from time to time. Of course, compared to the US Supreme Court at this moment, the Brazilian Supreme Court it's much more active. This has changed, yes, the role of courts in the world and in Brazil, Brodwyn. I should add, we have a very long and detailed constitution. So in Brazil, unlike the United States, almost everything can become a constitutional litigation. That's one thing. Secondly, we have one thing that you don't have in the United States, which are direct actions to the Supreme Court, and a whole set of plaintiffs that have standing to seek the Supreme Court. Dozens of actors, including all political parties. Almost every issue in Brazil will end up before the Supreme Court or will start up at the Supreme Court. Many times the Supreme Court, it doesn't say the last word, it says the first word, because you can challenge a law or a public policy on its face before the Supreme Court. So that's one reason for a certain degree of politicization of the Supreme Court in Brazil. The reason why we have become, to a certain extent, celebrities, as you said, is that the judgments before the Supreme Court in Brazil, they are broadcast on live television. So everyone can turn on the television and watch what's being decided. I'm not talking about the hearings. I'm talking about the deliberation. So I vote online. So people watch you, they agree with you, they love you, they hate you, they disagree with you. So it's not like a personal option, I'll become a celebrity. It's an institutional arrangement that exposes us very much. So you need to add these two things. It's very easy to get to the Supreme Court in Brazil. We decide the hardest cases you can think of, and on live television with people watching. And besides that, we have a competence that most constitutional courts or Supreme Courts don't have, which is a criminal jurisdiction, which is an awful jurisdiction that the Supreme Court played fairly well at a certain point, but then it didn't play well. I basically don't agree with what was done. A good part of the public was very disappointed with the court in its role in fighting corruption, including myself. I think these are, I would say, some data, Brodwyn, that will help you understand why we have such big exposure and to a certain extent we have become celebrities. And besides that, I should say, the court in the past years, some of the judges have had to play or decided to play a role of resisting to the attacks to democracy. And of course, you don't do this inside your chambers. So you have to go out and sometimes talk to the press or give talks with the proper messages you want to send. So it wouldn't be unfair to compare the Brazilian Supreme Court to the German Supreme Court, where everything seems to be going smooth. Tom and Susan, she just left the message here. She had to leave, but it was a pleasure to have her here. I think for Brazil, having a national body overseeing elections has worked just perfectly. And we were able to end frauds. There has never been a sustainable claim of fraud since we started with the electronic voting machines in 1996, except for Bolsonaro. Aécio Neves, when he lost to Dilma in a very close election, he asked for a inspection of the system by experts. It was done. Nothing was found wrong, and he accepted the defeat. So Brazil is an incredible country. The only person that really attacks the system for being fraudulent is a man that won with 58 million votes by a large margin to the second place. Many people think that his complaints weren't about the past elections. He was looking ahead and preparing the argument to claim that the new elections weren't fair. I must say that his position coincided with the polls that gave one of his adversaries an advantage in the 2022 election. So there has never been any evidence of fraud. There's no way you can fraud the system. It's a software that is submitted to the inspection of all parties, of the federal police, which is our FBI, the public ministry, which is sort of an attorney general office. Everyone inspects it and signs it. So it's just not possible. People will say, but they can attack the system and the computers of the electoral court. Yes, but our electronic ballot box never goes in network. It's totally outside. So even if you can crash the system, the ballot box is still safe, because at the end of the day, it prints the results of the elections. So you cannot access the electronic ballot box remotely. That's why the system is totally safe. We have a major problem, Tom, with political parties. It's a very fragmented party system. I had plans. I have 2 years as the head of the Electoral Court. I had plans to talk to the parties and to important leaderships and try to make things better. Even the electoral system that we have, it's an open list proportional system, has many problems, it's very expensive. It creates the incentives for new parties. I wanted to address this, but unfortunately, I had to spend most of my energy with the pandemics and, having elections during the pandemics, and then fighting this incredible proposal of going back to the paper vote, which took months of energy and political discussions that drove me away from things I really would like to have addressed, which were change the electoral system, change or made some major changes in the party system, more women participation in politics and in directive or bodies of the parties, things that are important. And I hope soon we can resume these discussions. As for Susan, comments, in Brazil, we have many problems. We have a major social question of poverty due to slavery, as you all know. That was a bigger problem in Brazil than in the US. We have structural racism, as you also have in the United States, but here it's not 15%, it's around 50% of people that were excluded. Racism, exclusion of African Brazilians is something directly connected to poverty and social injustice. So we have more problems than you do, believe me. But we don't have problems with disenfranchising voters, I should say. We don't have problems with fraud, not even with any reasonable claim of fraud. It's just not fair and reasonable. And the president of Brazil, he was in the press every day for months saying that the system was not reliable. And still over 70% of the people think the system is reliable. We have like 28% of people I need to convince that the system is reasonable, fair, and immune to fraud. Of course, there's no remedy in medicine or in law to people that don't accept defeat. And people can always say, if I lose, it was stolen. But that's not a credible argument. I was in the US a couple of days ago. I'm a senior fellow at the Kennedy School, and I was there. And I was reading like about 70%, that's where I read, of Republicans still believe that the elections were stolen. That's one striking thing of the times we are living, which is a totally parallel reality of these alternative facts. And people, I have a friend, and it happened when I was in the States, I saw the same. I have a friend, and he's a conservative person. Maybe I could say a right-wing person, but a decent person still. And we were talking some weeks ago, and the kind of information that he had about vaccine was totally different than the information I have, which I get from the press, from the media, from doctors, from the World Health Organization. And he said, no, I know that the vice president of Pfizer said it's not safe, that people are going to die, that in 10 years, everyone is going to be sick. I said, I never read anything like that. I don't believe these things. So we live in a world that we don't share a common public sphere. People are getting their information from totally different sources. And that's a bridge we'll need to build and try to have at least some common facts, which is totally different than having different opinions. But when you cannot agree with the facts, there's no way you can have a productive conversation. I think that's the worst problem with fake news. We are losing this common patrimony, this capacity of sharing at least some basic things. After that, we can think differently, but I think that's the worst effect of fake news. If we can't agree on our facts, it's impossible to agree with the solutions to the problems we have. About General Fernando, well, it wasn't my choice to be true. He will be the Secretary General of the next president, which does not mean that I'm criticizing or that I don't agree. The idea behind it, the two next presidents agreed that it would be convenient to have General Fernando. General Fernando was an advisor at the Supreme Court at some time ago, and he's friends with all of us. And I don't think there's any sort of military intervention in his choice. It has to do, though, with some sort of an antidote. Like if you have a former Minister of Defense that we trust, and he's a reliable person and a decent person, and if he is in here, how could you try to convince the armed forces? Because you can't give a coup without the armed forces. If you have a reliable person saying there's no fraud, this is a decent process, you kill the argument that the system is fraudulent. So when I say it wasn't my choice, I don't want it to sound like I disagree. It just wasn't my choice because I had different circumstances. But I think that's the reason. He comes as a civil person. He's just a person that has the confidence of many of us, including myself. And he has the confidence of people in the military. To be true, I don't think military should be in politics. I've been critical of that. But I don't have prejudice against military. There are decent people helping us do things. I don't have the perception that this is a risk. I do have the perception that during this past government, there were too many military in civil positions. That I agree, but I don't think that there is any risk of any sort of military leadership thinking in going back to the past and bringing them back to politics. I really think they've been behaving very well during the 1988 Constitution. I really don't think we'll have a problem with this. We're just a plane that had some turbulence, but I think we're going to land safe.
Thank you again, Minister Barroso. My apologies to everybody for going over. Thank you to those who were able to stay with us. I just want to, again, thank our panelists, Brody, Tom, and Sue for your thoughtful comments. I go back to Minister Barroso's comments about mentirocracy, about liocracy, and how this is a political crisis. There are political impacts of fake news, disinformation campaigns, but it goes deeper. It leads to a kind of social crisis in which we live in alternative realities, in which our lived empirical experiences seem no longer to really even overlap. So that is the challenge going forward. Thank you again. And I want to just invite everybody to our next event in this series, which will be on February 9th, again, looking at armed threats to democracy in Brazil. Thanks again, everybody.